Forever there shall be cold under the sun, rivers will run dry, and the forests wither. The stars shall grow dim, flicker and die, and death shall reign from forever to forever. The NECRARCHs are the most learned of vampires, more skilled at sorcery than with the blade. These skills have come at a price, however. The appearance of the NECRARCHs has grown so hideous and unnatural that an ordinary man cannot bear to look upon them, and many run screaming at the sight. When their great library was burned to the ground by fearful mortals, many NECRARCHs remained to burn with it. So strong was their devotion to knowledge. Of all true-born vampires, only Vasoran, founder of the NECRARCH bloodline and so-called father of vampires, was truly loyal to Nagash. Neferata worshipped Nagash for a time, but felt betrayed by his choice of Vashanesh over her to lead the vampires, and the others chose to ally with Nagash only out of convenience. So it was that when Nagash fell, Vasoran was the only true-born at his side to lay claim to the great necromancer's works. With these, and a select group of Nagash's acolytes, he fled from the land of the dead to continue working towards his master's dream in safety. He began work on the Grimoire Necronium, which contained not only a distillation of Nagash's magic, but also a series of prophecies showing Vasoran visions of the future. A world of bones, populated only by the dead and ruled by his bloodline. There was one flaw with this dream of an empire of corpses though: the lack of sources of blood. Thus, Vasoran searched for ways to relieve himself of the red thirst. Powerful necromantic magic made him less dependent on feeding than other vampires, so he could go for months or years without blood. There was a price, however: his reliance on pure dark magic rather than blood alone to give him power caused his visage to grow hideous and corpse-like. When he granted the blood kiss to his aging acolytes, this curse was passed to them as well. By drawing on the power of true Dar to a far greater degree than other vampires, their forms grew as twisted as their masters. Over time, their minds twisted along with their bodies, and many sank into madness. One such unfortunate was Melkhior, greatest of Vasoran's apprentices, who slew and ate his master. Fearing for their own lives after this coup, the NECRARCHs separated. Each suffered paranoid delusions, and although they all worked towards the same end, none of them trusted each other. They settled in all the nations of the old world, and the paranoid rantings that passed for communications between them slowly grew silent. Estalia was the chosen land of Nergul, who had been with Vasoran and Nagash in the earliest days. Even then, he dreamed of conquest and had observed Nagash's techniques and tactics closely. In 1750, he followed through on his plans, raised an army of the dead, tens of thousands strong, and waged war on the petty kingdoms of Estalia. Wherever he conquered, he gathered grimoires and artifacts, from the pettiest trinkets to the most potent tomes. His ultimate aim was to possess the Tome of Wisdom, which was kept in the city of Magritta. Nurgul's army laid siege to the city for a month, at the end of which the defenders fell strangely silent. Victorious, Nurgle flew into the city on his steed, a gigantic vampire bat, and entered the Temple of Myrmidia, where the Tome of Wisdom was housed. It was in that temple, beside the book he so prized, that his burned ashes were found. No one has ever explained this turn of events. Far to the north, in the Forest of Shadows, Melchior the Ancient pursued the Necrarch's dream in a much more subdued fashion. Now hopelessly mad, he saw little but his bizarre visions, occasionally going on a rampage amongst his servants to avoid the tedium. One of these servants, the Necrarch ZACHARIUS, sought to repeat Melchior's defeat of Vasoran and fought him in a magical duel. Melchior was the victor, but years later, ZACHARIUS returned, somehow vastly more powerful than he had been, and had his revenge on Melchior. Such is the Necrarch way. They are masters of necromancy, alchemy, and all of the natural philosophies. But they are hampered by the depth of their madness and distrust. Now, onto their prophecies and machinations. Ever since Vasoran had his grand vision of a future made of bones and dead flesh, his Necrarchs have placed great store in prophecy and fate. They spend much time attempting to divine the future, peering through the mists of time and recording their visions. Melchior the Ancient painted his visions onto canvases of flesh, some of which still screamed at his touch, but most prefer to record such things in tomes like the Grimoire Necronium. To bring about the fate seen in these prophecies, the Necrarchs conduct their research into the living and the undead, so that they may more fully understand how one is made into the other, in preparation for the day when all of the living become their eternal servants. At Geheimnisnacht, when both moons are full, the Necrarchs cast dark spells to blight the land, sucking the life out of an area and bringing their plans closer, one patch of scorched earth at a time. And now, their society. The preferred dwellings of Necrarchs are forbidden towers in the wilderness. There are several reasons for this. The vantage point of a tall tower gives greater access to Azir, the blue wind of magic, which they observe to gain insights into the future. A tower is easily defensible, and given their relative lack of a need for blood, they prefer to shy away from civilization. Most of all, whether they admit it or not, dwelling at the base of the heavens brings the Necrarchs closer to what they see themselves as gods. Of all the vampires, They are the most interested in the undead as replacements for the living, which they see as the weak and flawed creations of weak and flawed gods. Their towers are shared with improved forms of life, their own monstrous necromantic creations. These patchwork creatures are created from flesh and inanimate objects, melded with dark sorceries and forced into a twitching semblance of life. As well as such necromantic experimenting, they seek to master a variety of natural philosophies, depending on their inclinations. A necrarch may be a master of astronomy, alchemy, engineering, or any of the sciences as a matter of course. They are also masters of self-knowledge. They know the strengths and weaknesses of their own kind better than any, and perhaps this is another reason for their isolation. Betrayal is a constant threat to the necrarchs. They jealously hoard knowledge from each other. Their children in darkness are often their apprentices, and it is the nature of apprentices to seek to surpass their masters, even if it means theft and murder. This division is what has prevented them from conquering a nation of their own. Apart from Nurgul's march across Estalia, most necrarchs refrain from short-term empire building, preferring to dream of a future free of the living and slowly build their own miniature kingdoms of the undead and the outcast. Speaking of outcasts, they are drawn to them. Mutants and other freaks find acceptance that they could never find amongst humans. These dregs of society serve as lab assistants, occasional food sources, experimental subjects, and potential apprentices. They also venture out for supplies and protect their masters during daylight hours, as well as invite necrarchs across thresholds. And at last, their feeding and breeding practices. Dread the servants of the dead, but dread the necrarchs above all others. An Ostland proverb. Necrarchs feel the need to drink blood only rarely. They may go for months or even years without it. When they do feed, it is often on the outcasts they surround themselves with. However, this is not always the case. Some of them prefer to glut themselves when they feed, bringing along their servants to help them gain access to the abodes of the living, wherein they slay entire families in mad bloodlust before returning to their towers to pass away the next few years in quiet study before they must feed again. They make a point of studying their own thirst for blood. Reducing the frequency with which they feed is not enough. They seek to ultimately free themselves of thirst completely. Thus far, only ZACHARIUS, the ever-living, has found the secret to this. Other necrarchs have experimented with turning themselves into mobile nexuses of dark magic, replacing the need for blood with a need for warp stone, or recreating the elixir of life to Nagash's original recipe. But all have failed. Many of them fail miserably, becoming even more warped than they already are. They become bloated abominations that cannot walk, bestial creatures worse than the Strigoi, awful things like chaos spawn with impossible forms too bizarre to hold together. NECRARCHs typically choose their most gifted apprentices to receive the blood kiss. It is rare for a NECRARCH to find one they feel safe in granting this power to, as it may be turned against them. This is why they are the least numerous of the bloodlines. Newly turned NECRARCHs do not gain their twisted appearance immediately, but it does not take long. Within a month, they have been reduced to skeletal figures of nightmare. In these early days of their existence, they hunger for blood as much as a normal vampire, drinking large quantities to power the second transformation from monster to abomination. This harrowing experience often shatters what little sanity they have left. During this time, they also develop the powerful witch sight. They see the spirits of the dead as clearly as if they were solid, and the winds of magic appear more real than the sky or the trees. Conversely, the real world appears insubstantial and barely there. This causes the NECRARCHs to become disconnected from the world. As the endless years pass, they begin treating their surroundings as totally irrelevant. Traditionally, NECRARCHs take a NECRARCH name upon joining their ranks, leaving their old name behind along with their old life. This custom is shared by those necromancers who dedicate themselves to NECRARCH. Lahmizah, do you think I would call that capering fool my master? No, I speak of NECRARCH, the Undying King. I have seen him. All this time, I have searched for him, but I was looking in the wrong place. He could not be found among the souls of the dead, because he still reigns upon this earth. Vasoran the Wicked, known also as the Father of Vampires, is the founder and the head of the NECRARCH bloodline of vampires. Vasoran, once a prince of Rasetra, used his position as High Priest of Lahmia to poison the mind of the young princess Neferatem, destined to become Queen of Lahmia. She was a willful girl, fascinated by magic and death, who was frustrated by the mortuary cult's unwillingness to pass on their teachings to women. Secretly, Vasoran nurtured her thirst for this forbidden knowledge, coaching her in the magical knowledge he learned at NECRARCH's side. After NECRARCH's fall, she was only too willing to save several forbidden scrolls from the pyres. After her father took NECRARCH's position as King of Khemri, Neferatem began her rule of Lahmia, and behind the locked doors of the palace, she studied the scrolls and began to emulate the simpler necromantic magic. All the while, Vasoran was testing the waters of Lahmia's mortuary cult, learning which priests were sympathetic to his ends and which would have to be dealt with. Those who could not be twisted to the teachings of NECRARCH, he warned of Neferatem's dark practices, a calculated act of betrayal that the Queen would not learn of for many years. So it was that the priesthood fractured, some loyal to their Queen and others set against her. This culminated in an attack on the palace, a rebellion that was only thwarted when Neferatem herself emerged, surrounded by a crackling nimbus of dark energy, and unleashed the full fury of her burgeoning necromantic abilities on her foes. The remaining rebels were rounded up and executed, leaving only those in the mortuary cult whom Vasoran could trust. With their aid, he and Neferatem continued their studies, focusing on one ritual above all others, the creation of the elixir of life that had granted NECRARCH his immortality. They eventually found success, but in an unexpected form. The version of the elixir they created gave them immortality, but it also fundamentally changed the nature of their beings. They became the first vampires. All this time, the Undying King has been rebuilding his strength in secret, far from the eyes of men. He has taken a great mountain and made it his fortress. I have seen its towers wreathed in the smoke of countless forges, where his servants make ready for the day of Nehekara's demise. And that day swiftly approaches. He is already clad in the panoply of war, and he holds a dark and terrible crown in his hand. The days of mankind are numbered. From Vasoran, the true servant of NECRARCH. Vasoran, Prince of Rasetra, was a spy of NECRARCH that held the position of High Priest of Lahmia. From this vantage point, he began to corrupt the then Princess Neferata's mind as he instructed her in the magical arts he had learned from NECRARCH. This manipulation drove her to recover some of the great necromancer's treaties when he was defeated by the Priest Kings, saving them from destruction and bringing them to Lahmia, where she started studying the dark arts on her own. With Vasoran's aid, she concocted an almost perfect copy of NECRARCH's elixir of life, and by drinking it, she became the first vampire. Neferata tried at first to hide her dark condition, but realizing that could not last for very long, she gave the rest of the elixir to several members of her royal court, and Vasoran was one of the first to drink it. He and the rest of the undead court created the Temple of Blood, ruling the city of Lahmia as gods and hunting down its inhabitants to feed. However, they were all unwittingly manipulated by Vasoran, who in turn received instructions from NECRARCH. He is coming, and when he does, you will grovel like a worm at his feet. Eventually, the secret of the Lahmian court was discovered, and the rest of the cities of Nehekara launched their armies against the vampires. After a determined defense, the city fell, and the surviving vampires fled to Nagashizar, where they joined Nagash's hosts as army commanders when he tried to exact revenge on Nehekara and reconquer the kingdoms. This invasion failed, however, and most of the vampires fled again to escape the great necromancer's wrath. Only Vasoran remained at his side, and during the time he spent in his company, he learned a lot about the netherworld beyond life. Unfortunately for him, Al-Khadizar killed his master only a year later, and somehow he made his escape with many of the works of Nagash. Unlike the other vampire lords, who dreamed of creating a new, great nation of their own, he chose some of the most intelligent priests of Nagash, turned them into his vampire pupils, and taught them the dark arts of necromancy. He studied many of his master's scriptures, and with the help of his acolytes, transcribed his notes in the Grimoire Necronium, which not only included a distillated version of Nagash's magic, but also a series of prophecies that showed him a vision of the future, a world covered in bones, populated only by the dead and ruled by his vampiric clan. But his dream of a corpse empire had a flaw. It lacked blood. Because of this, he started using dark magic in order to permanently sate the thirst that all vampires suffered. Although his powerful necromancy allowed him to depend less and less on blood to survive, his abusing of the raw dark magic began to warp his body and mind, and he grew horrible and ghastly. When Vasoran gave the blood kiss to his acolytes, he passed this curse onto them as well, and in time, many of them succumbed to madness. Little is known of the place where Vasoran hid after Nagash's defeat. He stayed away from the rest of the world for centuries as he studied the art of necromancy. Using the knowledge from the Book of Nagash, he spent most of the time walking through the spirit world of the dead, and this would be his doom. In order to cross the barrier that separates the world of the living from that of the dead, his body fell into long trances, while his soul traveled freely through the realms of the deceased. It was his best student, Melkhior, who took advantage of this to put a stake through his heart and devour his body. It is unknown whether this was due to manipulation from the Book of Nagash, or simply an act of madness. Be that as it may, after Vasoran's death, the NECRARCHs disseminated and spread throughout the world. However, it is ultimately implied that Vasoran did not truly perish, instead possessing the body of his murderous pupil. Death will only be the beginning of your eternal pain, mortal. Beyond the grave, there awaits a world of horrors that you could scarcely begin to ever imagine. Melkhior the Ancient was the first Necrarch created by Vasoran. It was Melchior himself who named Vasoran's bloodline as NECRARCHS after he killed and cannibalized his progenitor. Upon Nagash's defeat, Vasoran took many of his master's writings and studied them with the aid of his acolytes and his apprentice, Melchior, transcribing his notes in the dread Grimoire Necronium. His mastery of necromancy grew so profoundly that he was able to limit the red thirst that drove vampires to live dangerously close to mankind. By drawing on the power of true Dar to a far greater degree than other vampires, their forms grew as twisted as their masters. Over time, their minds twisted along with their bodies, and many sank into madness. One such unfortunate was Melchior, his finest, most diligent student, and a fervent Nagashi disciple. Vasoran's studies of the spirit world and the ways of necromancy became an end in their own right, and he lost sight of his master's vision. It was this that ultimately led to his undoing. Powerful though he was, Vasoran had to enter a trance-like state to interact with the spirit world. Yet Melchior seized one such moment to use to his advantage. Perhaps Nagash spoke to him from the beyond, telling him to slay Vasoran. Perhaps he perceived his master's lack of purpose. Perhaps he looked down on him, for Melchior was able to interact with the spirit world without need of entering into a trance. Whatever the case, Melchior leapt at his master and ripped out his throat, draining him of every last drop of blood before eating his entire body over the course of 3 days, so as to assure he absorbed all his master's essence. From that moment on, Melchior was hailed as the master of his bloodline, a bloodline that he named NECRARCH to symbolize their sanctification of death. Melchior the Ancient pursued the NECRARCH's dream in a much more subdued fashion. He lived far from human settlements, and his secret tower is hidden from view in the great forest of shadows by powerful enchantments. In the highest chamber of this tower, the ancient vampire worked alone. He was decayed, irredeemably evil, and utterly insane. He experimented with the living, trying to find out how they can be made to understand the benefit of joining the undead and how they could overcome their fear of the dead. Countless men have died in Melchior's obsession, but still, the answer he searched for eluded him. Pain, suffering, and horror fascinated this mad being. The dungeons and torture chambers of his dark tower were filled with wretched prisoners who underwent indescribable agony to satisfy the curiosity of this insane vampire lord. Melchior's fortress is a monument to suffering and terror, filled with the results of his insane experiments. Zombies that are half dead and half alive, severed heads which scream endlessly in the darkness, limbs that crawl in lightless passageways, and countless other horrors created by Melchior's dark arts. Now and then, The ancient vampire leads his undead servants out of his stronghold to capture new victims for his experiments, or to swell the undead legions that guarded him. At such times, armies of zombies commanded by the twisted acolytes of Melchior poured from the forest and hunted for the living to bring back to their master. In his tower in the Forest of Shadows, he continued Vasoran's work on the Grimoire Necronium, his visions of the future growing more disturbed over the centuries as his sanity cracked further and further. Eventually, his visions grew so vivid they could not be depicted in prose, and he began painting on canvases of skin. His dungeons were filled with the living for him to torment. He often turned his mad attentions on his loyal servants as well. One of these servants, the NECRARCH ZACHARIUS, sought to repeat Melchior's defeat of Vasoran and fought Melchior in a magical duel. Melchior was the victor, but years later, Zacharius returned, somehow vastly more powerful than he had been, and had his revenge on Melchior. Melchior was not destroyed, however, but slumbers whilst regaining his strength so that he can return to avenge himself upon his wayward student. Melchior has almost the same knowledge of necromantic arts as the most powerful living necromancers, for he has thousands of years of experience in these matters. He is so suffused with dark magic that he is now more part of the world of the dead than the living, and is decomposed to the point where he is a skeletal, reeking horror. His eyes are two pools of darkness that mirror the purest evil in everything they see, and an aura of death hangs heavily about him. In the total darkness of his hellish fortress, the ancient vampire paints on human skins. He paints terrifying scenes of a world where there are no living, where the dead walk the land and withered, undead trees blight the bleak landscape. Melchior claims that he paints visions of the future, glimpses of the time that is to come. Perhaps his visions are true, and the known world is doomed to the horrible existence of unlife. He rides a huge, winged nightmare into battle, which is said to be made out of carcasses of monsters slain by himself. And to end things off, his war gear. First up, Painbringer. Painbringer is the black sword of Melchior, said to be made from the magical life force of insane men. The mere touch of this blade brings insanity and hideous pain. The Grimoire Necronium. Written by Melchior himself, this book is one of the greatest works of necromancy. In its pages are described the blasphemous rites and evil spells that allow wizards to summon and command the dead. And the Black Cloak of Lahmia. This cloak is one of the great treasures of Lahmia, the city of the vampires. Merely looking at the cloak can make eyes bleed and sanity vanish. And a little extra information. It is heavily implied in the Time of Legends that Vasoran's spirit slew and then possessed Melchior's body after he was murdered. This means that Melchior has long been but a body inhabited by Vasoran. Today is a good day to be dead. Zacharius, the Ever-Living, is an immensely powerful vampire of the NECRARCH bloodline that rules over the Forest of Shadows. Little is known of the life of Zacharius before he succumbed to the lure of the necromantic arts. He studied under the tutelage of Dieter Helsnicht, the infamous Doom Lord of the Undead, a necromancer expelled from Middenheim, who now launched attacks on that city from a fortress in the Forest of Shadows. Whilst Helsnicht busied himself with tactics and raising armies, Zacharius took note of his surroundings. He saw they were not the first to work powerful necromancy in the forest. He saw strange flows in the winds of magic, which led him all the way to the tower of the NECRARCH Lord, Melkhior the Ancient. For weeks, Zacharius observed the tower and its guards, plotting to break in through the crypt at the tower's base to steal the vampire's grimoires. He magically blinded the undead guardians to his presence, but was captured by Melchior's living servants before he had even made it inside. He was brought before the vampire, who recognized his great potential and granted him the Blood Kiss. The newly created NECRARCH was horrified by the changes his body underwent and swore to take revenge on his father in darkness. Knowing he was too weak to confront the ancient vampire, he bided his time and studied like a good pupil, and so began to embrace the power which Melchior had bestowed upon him. Each night, the two would rise, and Melchior would warn Zacharias that he grew bored of his company, and that he would probably kill him before dawn. But every night, the pupil surprised the master with his dedication and growing power. Melchior taught his acolyte everything he knew, but never let Zacharias near his precious Book of Nagash. Melchior was mad, even by the standards of NECRARCHs, and would periodically fall into rages and slaughter his living servants, bathing in their blood and drinking it in a great feast of flesh. Zacharias was wise, and always avoided his master's wrath. It was during one of these occasions that Zacharias boldly crept into Melchior's chamber. There, on a great plinth, was the unholy tome. Unfortunately for him, Melchior was not as unaware as he seemed. He returned to his chamber whilst his pupil was still reading, and a great fight ensued. Invigorated by the blood of his dead slaves, Melchior was too powerful for Zacharias, who barely escaped with his life into the wilds, nursing his wounds. Deeply wounded, Zacharias fled into the Middle Mountains. For the following year, he was pursued by the minions of Melchior. From one cave refuge to the next he would flee, tired and severely emaciated from lack of blood. He would no sooner find a suitable, secluded hiding place than his location would be discovered. Zacharius fed on wild animals wherever he could, but the constant running exhausted him. Finally, he stumbled into a large, dark cavern where he found a small niche deep inside, and there he fell into a sound slumber. Totally exhausted from the fight with Melchior and the constant pursuit of his dark servants, Zacharias' rest was to last for over a decade. During this time, a black dragon also discovered the cave. Unaware of the undead abomination which slept within, she made her nest there and, as do all dragons, gathered a small mound of treasure around her. When Zacharias awoke, his thirst was great, and the sleeping dragon was a perfect source of nourishment. Finding soft, exposed flesh on the dragon's underside, he bit deep into the slumbering monster. The blood of the great beast flowed through the veins of Zacharias, empowering him with untold strength. Such is the might of a vampire that even a dragon is unable to wake from his deadly bite. Over the following month, Zacharias drank from the great beast, draining it clean of blood. In doing so, he discovered the secret previously known only to Aborash and his blood dragon kin. He became free of the thirst for blood and was filled with unholy power. Using the dark necromantic powers he had learned from Melchior, he raised the dragon from death and flew on its back to Melchior's hidden keep, where he fought a great battle with his master. It is said that so powerful were the magic forces unleashed that the tower was all but destroyed. When the dust and debris cleared, Zacharias was the victor. Of Melchior, no one knows of his fate. Some say he was slain by Zacharias, who drank his blood to gain further powers. Others believe that he is in hiding, licking his wounds whilst plotting revenge on his former pupil. Whatever his fate was, Zacharias claimed all of the magical wealth that his master had acquired and hoarded over his long rule of terror, including the powerful Book of NECRARCHs. Zacharias now rules over the Forest of Shadows from a rebuilt keep, studying the books so long denied to him, and both the orcs of the mountains and the people of the forest live in equal fear of the vengeance of Zacharias the Ever-Living. And now, on to the last of the most infamous Necrarch vampires. Interlopers, you must be very brave, very stupid, or very desperate to enter my domain. It matters nothing what your reasons are. You will all die here, and then you will serve me even in death. WALDAKIR Ratep was a powerful vampire lord of the Necrarch Brotherhood. An ancient vampiric horror, WALDAKIR Ratep fought and slew the personal champion of Mundred Skavenslayer, taking the knight's enchanted sword as a trophy. Centuries later, In the aftermath of the Great War Against Chaos, a warrior priest by the name of Gunther pieced together Ratep's life, his movements, his wars, his purpose. The enchanted blade WALDAKIR possessed was said to have the power of demon slaying, and Gunther hoped it would be enough to fell Otto von Gruber, the corrupt Elector Count of Ostermark and favored cultist of Nurgle. Thus, Gunther and his allies, the young Stefan von Kessel, would go on to fight against WALDAKIR's undead hordes, a host of long-dead skeleton warriors and shrieking tomb banshees. Delving into the dark caverns of the vampire's inner sanctum, the pair eventually came face to face with the NECRARCH himself. At first, their opponent seemed invulnerable, rising back to unlife each time he was struck down. However, the two heroes were able to destroy the enchanted sarcophagi that fueled the vampire's protective aura. Stripped of his power, WALDAKIR Ratep was slain that day, or so it seemed. The war for the Nemesis crown. The Second Empire scouting party had been obliterated as swiftly as the first, but this victory did not set WALDAKIR at ease. While it was clear that the lackeys of Karl Franz were searching for something, he could not be sure whether that something was him. It was possible that the vampire's forays into Talabheim had finally drawn enough attention to merit a determined hunt. This was possible, but unlikely. However, one did not remain alive and immortal by taking reckless chances. WALDAKIR took wing to the haunted land of Sylvania. As one of the eldest of his kind, vampires heeded his call. Many of Sylvania's undead had been leaderless since the death of Manfred von Carstein, and were easily bent to WALDAKIR's will. Those he could not dominate, he deceived. Those he did not deceive, he simply slew. In a matter of days, Ratep had roused a mighty host, a host that swiftly descended upon Sturland. After setting the wheels in motion, WALDAKIR swiftly returned to his lair. The plan was working. In his absence, the undead host had soon overwhelmed the garrisons of Stufbad and Timwald. None but a fool would waste time hunting for a hidden vampire when so many undead were in plain sight. He was pleased. He was in receipt of plenty of raw material from the failed incursions into his lair. A new undead realm could yet spring from the ruins of the Eastern Empire, while the attentions of WALDAKIR's enemies remain fixed elsewhere.